Of course, this is the warm-up event for the International Airport Boarding Gate Heats taking place all over the world. Who are those people? We've all got a ticket. Well, none of us have a ticket anywhere, as it's the end of days.
Yeah, see, it's the end of days. Everybody's wondering about it, isn't it? That's what we're talking about this morning. So grab your note sheet. We also have Bible studies that are prepared. You can get them online. Bible study for this week it's going to be dynamite. So you're going to want to go through that. Let's admit it. You know, you talk about this subject of the last days, the end of the age. It has just an inherent fascination about it, man. It's just got summer blockbuster written all over it. The first Christians were stirred up by the thought of Jesus' coming. Paul has to write the Thessalonians and calm them down a little bit. In his second letter to them, man, they're getting ready to get their lawn chairs and go out to the nearest hill and get ready for Jesus' coming. And Paul says to them, breathe, people, breathe, take it easy. Well, this morning, we want to jump right back into this topic, and I want to put you back in that frying pan I left you sizzling in last week when we were exploring the question: are these the last days? And some of you have been thinking terrible thoughts about me because I left you dangling at the end last week. And to that, you know what I say? Sorry. Well. But the ground we talked about last week was important. To know that biblically speaking, we are in the last days and have been since Jesus' resurrection, and that these are the final days in God's plan of winning the earth back to himself, because now all that is left to do is to take the message, the gospel of Jesus, to the earth. And to let them know that Jesus has died for them, and hopefully in seeing God's big picture plan of how he wants to fill this earth with his glory, his beauty, his goodness, his love, his truth. Hopefully that has been an encouragement to you as you've thought about it. That no matter how dark and bleak these days become, God is with us. But I know that's not what you wanted to know. I know that's not the question you were asking. You want to know how dark and bleak the days are going to become. So armed with your new knowledge of where we are in the Bible's timeline, the question you want to ask is, are we in the last days of the last days? Inquiring minds want to know. Well, we're not alone in wondering. Jesus' disciples were very curious about all of this. In our Bibles today, and I want to invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 24. The story tells us that Jesus and the disciples were walking through Jerusalem. It was Jesus' last week before his crucifixion. And they were walking through the temple area, and the disciples who were from Galilee, they were country bumpkins. They didn't get into the big city all that often. And they were oohing and aahing at the size of the great temple, which reached in places 150 feet tall. And as they're marveling about it, Jesus out of nowhere says, "Truly I say to you, not one stone shall be left on another in this place." And then he didn't say another word. It's like rolling a verbal hand grenade inside their brains. He knew that their minds were going to blow. Nobody said another word about it till they got back to their home base of operations at the Mount of Olivet that night. But as soon as they get there, they gather around Jesus and they say, "Lord, when? When is this going to happen, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age?" And Jesus answers their question in surprising detail, and his answer is recorded in Matthew 24 and Matthew 25. You'll notice if you have one of those red letter Bibles that it's all in red. This is one of the longest sermons we have from Jesus in our Bibles. Luke has a version of this as well that we'll refer to. So this morning, we want to ask the question, with some revision from last week, are we in the last days of the last days? And I want to use Matthew and what Jesus says here as a roadmap this morning. We want to ask three questions this morning. If you've got your note sheet, you'll see them there. What will conditions be like in these times? What signs will we be given that those days are approaching? And how should I live in light of what Jesus is saying? So, first things first, let's tackle this first question. What will conditions be like at the end of the age. Now, the suspicion that many believers have had in studying eschatology, that's the word, remember, that refers to the study of last things. The suspicion of many of us is that these days will be dark. When Janice and I moved to Minnesota, all the natives said, well, what you get in Minnesota are 10 months of winter and 2 months of rough sledding. And so what the Bible is telling us is that these times will be a time of rough sledding. And from what Jesus says in Matthew 24, these suspicions that we have are largely accurate. One of the first things that you need to observe here as you look at these verses is that the disciples, in questioning Jesus, actually asked him two questions. They said, Lord, when will this be? And they were thinking about the destruction of the temple. When's this thing coming down? When will this happen? But then, like a good politician, they slip in a little pork with the bill. They ask him a second question that's weighing on their minds. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? See, that's a twofer. And the reason why it's important to see this is that Jesus, in his reply to them, answers both questions, but in a blended mashup sort of way. He doesn't say, well, here's the answer to your first question. This is when the temple will be destroyed. And now here's the answer to when I'm coming back. Now, he weaves it all together, which makes it challenging to interpret. For example, Jesus says in verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. You read that and you say, well, clearly he got that wrong, didn't we? Here we are 2,000 years later. Well, no, he didn't. You see, he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Just as Thanos was coming, so the Romans were coming. For those who don't know, Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed by Rome less than 40 years later in AD 70. After a number of Jewish uprisings in the years leading up to this, Rome finally sent the full might of her military power against Jerusalem and wiped it off the map, destroyed the temple, literally stone by stone, for there were rumors that there was gold embedded between the rocks. And then they scattered the Jewish people to the four winds, leaving only behind that part of the temple we now know as the Wailing Wall. So Jesus nailed it. And there were other things in this chapter that Jesus said which speak to that terrible time. Verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. Now Matthew, in his gospel, wrote largely for Jewish believers. Luke wrote largely for Gentile believers. And so in his version of this sermon, he doesn't quote Daniel, but he interprets it for them. In Luke's translation, or a version of what Jesus says, he says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee. See, they're talking. Jesus is talking here about the Roman invasion that was coming. And when you see that starting to play out, Jesus says, get out of the city now. Run for your lives and pray that it doesn't happen in winter, he says, which is an interesting verse. Even in the midst of catastrophe, God cares for us. And we know from the history of the time, written by a man named Eusebius several centuries later, that the Christians living in Jerusalem during those days, when they see the pot starting to boil over, called to mind Jesus' words, and they fled the city, and their lives were spared, but everyone else perished. Now, this is playing with some of your minds because you've been taught, you probably heard it in the Left Behind books, that all that's in this chapter pertains to the end of days. I thought the Jews were going to rebuild the temple, and then some confederation of European powers led by Gog of Magog, Russia, is going to swoop down into Israel. And then, I'm not saying that those things won't happen. We know that Israel will play a role in the events at the end of the age, and we'll say more about that momentarily. But here's another thing that we need to understand about biblical prophecy. Oftentimes in the Bible, when a prophet in the Old Testament would foresee a great event happening long away in the future, oftentimes He would provide prototypes or templates of what that event would be like. We see this all the time in the Old Testament. Psalm 22, King David writes a psalm where he describes his sufferings. My God, why have you forsaken me? But as he goes on in the psalm, suddenly he begins describing the sufferings of a man that is clearly not David. He describes things that never happened to him. He describes a man whose hands and feet are being pierced, who's surrounded by an angry mob who are mocking him. He's dying of thirst. They're gambling for his clothing. Well, what's going on here? Well, Jesus told us that the Spirit was on David in his writing, and clearly this is a case where the Spirit of God was giving David a vision of Jesus' crucifixion. And David's sufferings as a king were just a prototype of the sufferings that the King of Kings would endure. Isaiah 7 is another example of this book. In Isaiah chapter 7, he describes Isaiah, a child being born, who would be assigned to the king of Israel in those days. Turns out it was Isaiah's own child. But as he goes on in chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11, he describes another child whose birth would bless the entire world. He would be a light to the Gentiles. Of the end of his government, there would be no end. The nations would seek him. He would be called Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Isaiah's child, you see, was just a prototype, a template of the real divine child that would come. We see this in Daniel and his prophecies about a terrible ruler who would terrorize God's people. Well, this is exactly what Jesus is doing in Matthew 24. The destruction of the temple and the conditions of the world in the time when this would happen would be a template, a pattern of what would happen at the end of the age. And that's why Jesus lumps all these together. Now, I know, speaking honestly, that this is something that none of us wants to hear. But Jesus, in this chapter, is like a good airline pilot who, knowing that the landing is going to be rough, landing in a storm, says to the people before they land, heads down, brace yourselves. Jesus is being like a good doctor here who knows that what he's going to do as he's fixing you is going to hurt. And he says that to you. Okay, now this is going to hurt, but we're going to do this together. And you'll get better on the other side of this. So Jesus is saying to us to get this world fixed, to get the evil out of it, to get us through to the other side where the glory and goodness of God are filling the earth. It's going to be a bumpy ride at the end. Paul wrote to Timothy and said these words, understand this, that in the last days there'll be terrible times. And the Greek word there means troublesome and harsh and fierce. The prophet Amos said, you do not want to go through these days. Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you have the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light. And when you think about it, it actually makes sense why this would be so. The reason why these days will in all likelihood be very dark is because these will be the times of evil's last stand. Revelation 12:12 says, but woe to you, O earth, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath because he knows that his time is short. A couple summers ago, I was mowing the yard, and I noticed off by the edge, by a row of some evergreen trees, that there were more wasps buzzing around than usual. So I had a suspicion, pulled apart the branches, and sure enough, found a big wasp nest in there the size of a mini Death Star. So I went and armored up and got the hose and all that. Now, do you think the wasps said to me as I approached, Mister, we're sorry, didn't know this was your place. We're going to move. We're moved. No worries. Now, they didn't go down without a fight. And my friends, the battle between good and evil that has raged upon the earth since the days when Cain first took a club to Abel's head. That battle that's always taking place, sometimes running behind the scenes and sometimes flaring out like a massive all-out war. Well, this will be the final convulsion of that battle. If the earth is going to be filled with the beauty and glory of God, the only way we're going to get there is with this taking place. Evil won't surrender. Evil won't come to its senses, and evil won't stop coming after the good. There must come a time when God says, enough, this stops now. So, those will be the conditions in all likelihood in the last days of the last days. Which brings us to a second question this morning that Jesus answers in the Olivet Discourse. What signs will be given that those days are near? And there are several categories of signs that Jesus gives in the reading as we look at verse 4. First, he gives us what I call general signs, or, and I'll explain this, broken earth judgments. Verse 4, see that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and a kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. And interestingly, in Luke's version of Jesus' sermon, he adds the word pestilence. There'll be earthquakes, famines, and pestilence, plagues, pandemics. Now, you read through this list, and many people will observe and ask, well, what's so special about this list? Those things are always going on. How can they function as signs to us? Some Christians like to argue and make the case that these things will increase in frequency as the ends approach, like birth pains, just as Jesus compares them to. Possibly, but that's a difficult argument to prove. Are you really wanting to say that the sufferings that we've gone through, say, in this pandemic, compare with what they went through back in the 14th century? The Black Death was upon Europe and took a third of Europe out. I don't think that's what Jesus is trying to say here. I think Jesus' point is that these are general signs that you see all the time, but every time you see one of these things occur, it's speaking to us a message that we need to hear. A message that says this earth is broken. The earth is under the curse of sin, the Bible says. It's groaning under the weight of all that we've done to it. And so with every earthquake, with every famine, with every tornado, with every plague that comes along, is a flashing yellow sign that says to us that there is nothing lasting here for us to hold on to. In other words, stop living as though this life is all there is. Stop acting as though this earth is your home forever and ever, amen. It's not. Quit pretending that you're only a body and a brain. You don't. You also have a soul. And Jesus says, what will it profit you if you gain the whole world and forfeit your soul? My friends, you were made by God and for God. If we miss this, we miss it all. Science is wonderful. It's a gift from God. And thank goodness for science. And please God, may we find a vaccine for what we're going through now. But don't make science your God. Politics is necessary. Thank goodness for leadership, for good government. Sure beats chaos and unrest. But don't make politics your God. And unless I repent and turn to God and be living for Him and seeking first His kingdom and not my own kingdom, unless I do that, I won't be ready for what life throws at me. These are the lessons that we learn from the general signs. These aren't the only signs that Jesus gives here, though. He goes on. Then there are religious signs to look for. Namely, there will be spiritual opposition and persecution. Verse 9, then they will deliver you up to tribulation. They will put you to death. You'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will come and will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. False prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of lawlessness increasing, the love of many will grow cold. Well, this just keeps getting jollier and jollier, doesn't it? But it's a consistent theme in the Bibles, in both Old and New Testaments. That is part of this ongoing battle between good and evil. Those who choose to live for good and those who choose to live for God will come under fire. They'll take hits. Jesus said, in the world we will have tribulation. Paul wrote to Timothy and said, indeed, anyone who wants to have a righteous life will be persecuted. And just as it was for the first century saints who came under enormous pressure from the antichrist of their time, so the last generation saints will come under enormous pressure from the antichrist of their time. You may be thinking, well, I thought there was one antichrist. Well, there may be the granddaddy of them all at the end of all things. But John wrote this, 1 John 2, verse 18, he says, "Children, it's the last hour, and as you've heard that the Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come." John is saying to us, don't be so riveted on the evil that's coming at the end that it blinds us from seeing the evil that's at work all around us now. Don't be so consumed with the tribulation to come, the great tribulation, that it causes you to miss all the tribulation that the church on the earth right now is going through. And some of you are hyperventilating right now. I just know it. Grabbing your mask. You're saying, but wait, I thought we were going to be raptured out before all this happened. Look, I would love nothing more than for that to be a case. I'm a wuss. I hate pain as much as the next guy. I cry like a baby when I stub my toe. I don't want to face times like this. But if I were you, the wiser course of action would be to, kind of like the saying goes, pray for pre, but prepare for post. Sure, yeah, ask for the quick trip around the board, go directly to go, collect 200. Woo-hoo-hoo! Wouldn't that be great? But you better start working into your theology, into your thinking right now. The strong possibility that when Jesus told his followers that they had to pick up their cross and follow him, he was talking about more than your mother-in-law. I always found it eye-opening as I've studied eschatology that the teaching of what's called the pre-tribulation rapture really arose within the Western church, and quite recently, in the 19th century, we can see where it arises. You know, isn't this interesting? The church that on the earth has arguably the easiest, safest, most comfortable journey is the one that comes up with this idea. And to think that right now the Western church is dealing with some really harsh conditions. Man, we can't get into our buildings, and sometimes, you know what, there's not enough bandwidth to conduct our WebEx meetings. Oh, the humanity. Meanwhile, while we're suffering this, you know, the church in India, many of them are having their buildings burned to the ground. And Christians in Nigeria right now are facing an antichrist horror known as Boko Haram. And pastors in China and Iran, just randomly while they're coming home from work one day, just suddenly disappear and are never seen again. I think Jesus, my friends, is trying to prepare our hearts here for something in saying these words to us. And then he gives a third type of sign here in verse 14. We could call these the end of the age sign. These would be things to look for that would be unique to that period of time. And Jesus gives us a big one in verse 14, a huge example of this. When he says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." We talked about this last week, that the whole purpose of the last days that we are in, meaning the last 2,000 years since Jesus' resurrection, the whole purpose for this time was to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. Jesus said, go and make disciples of what? All nations. Normandy, back in World War II, the beach of Normandy was a beachhead on which the Allies planted themselves. And from that place, they pushed back the Nazis, mile after mile, city after city, liberating as they went, battle after battle, conquering territory, setting captives free as they went. My friends, the hill of Calvary where Jesus died was our beachhead. And from that place, since that time, the kingdom of God has been pushing evil back, step by step, mile by mile. First Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, then Asia Minor, then the Roman Empire, Africa, Europe, India, down to our time. Mile after mile, country by country, century after century, until we get to the end of it all, and the book of Revelation tells us this scene, this beautiful scene of a great multitude that nobody can count, standing before the throne of God, crying out, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. For by your blood you ransomed people from God, from every tribe, tongue, and nation." And my friends, when you look around the globe right now, and you look at all those places where the love of Christ has reached, and the word of Christ has penetrated, and the name of Christ is being lifted up and worshiped, does it not cause something inside your heart to leap for joy? Another general sign to look for, I mentioned them earlier, is Israel. Huge end times, end of the age sign. Wish I had time to explore this. In Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse of Jesus' sermon, in chapter 21 of Luke, in verse 24, he says something that sends chills down my spine when I read it. After Jerusalem's destruction, Jesus says this: Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. In other words, Jesus is saying Jerusalem will be in the power of the Gentiles, and he suggests that it will be a long, long time. And then, at some point down the road, the Jews will get their land back. The end of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. Paul says something similar in Romans chapter 11, that God at the end will bring everything full circle in his plan of salvation. So much so that when everything is all said and done, all Israel will be included in it. I mean, read your newspapers. Israel is in the headlines all the time. And you know it's true. Israel is not on the most favored nation status list of most countries. There's a bizarre, almost unexplainable hatred toward Israel, which really can only be understood when you stand back and look at it through spiritual eyes. Another sign of the end of the age is the rise and spread of technology. A clue to us that a stage of sorts is being set. We talked about this last week, how God created us to develop technology and to use it to spread His beauty, His goodness, His love, and His truth on the earth. But then we sinned. And now, along with the love and goodness that we would spread with our technology, we also spread evil, bucketfuls of it. And so God, over the years, has kept us safe, I guess you could say, from our worst instincts by keeping back, by postponing the development of human technology. Technology is great, used rightly. I read yesterday in a New York Times article that right now, as we speak, there are 3 billion people on this planet who don't even have clean water with which to wash their hands. They can't even do the most basic thing needed to protect themselves from this virus. Oh, for a time when the technology that you and I take for granted can be taken to the whole earth. And maybe that'll be something we do, in the millennium. Verbal hand grenade. But technology used wrongly in the hands of a person or a government that surrendered to evil. The only reason Hitler lost World War II is because we discovered the jet engine and the nuclear bomb first. There are scenes in the book of Revelation that have always been interpreted as metaphorical. This scene of a mark that's needed on a hand or a forehead without which you couldn't buy or sell. How metaphorical, we thought. Scene in Revelation where great events are seen by the entire earth at the same time. A world power with true global dominance arising. Oh, that's just metaphor. Nowadays, the possibilities for such things extend beyond metaphor. I mean, come on, I saw Hunger Games. General signs, religious signs, end of the age signs. So where does that leave us? How should we live in light of this? Well, Jesus told His disciples, and He's telling us precisely how we should live, and He does it in the whole back half of His sermon, and it's written for us in Matthew 25. And I'll only highlight these as we wrap up. And in the Bible study that we prepared for this teaching, I want you to spend at least half of your time looking at this chapter and these 3 stories. And again, you can download these from our website. I encourage you to do that. So Jesus finishes this sermon by telling us these 3 stories, one right after another. The parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the talents, and the parable of the sheep and the goats. And each story, each parable teaches a unique lesson which illustrates for us what Jesus wants us to do in light of what He's taught us here. Each story also has some common elements, and I want you to wrestle and discover these. So in each story, there's an authority figure. I want you to find out who that is and what he says and what he does. Also find out in the story, in each story, there's a group of foolish people and a group of wise people. I want you to study the stories and find out what is it that they do that makes them wise or foolish. And then each story identifies a central lesson on how we are to live in the last days. And I want to give you each lesson for each story right now, real quickly as we finish, and then you go deeper with your reflections this week. So here's the main lesson that comes with the story of the 10 virgins. Write this down. How should we live according to this story? We should watch and pray. The foolish virgins in the story fall asleep and they're not ready when the bridegroom comes. So watchfulness pertains to not falling asleep. Jesus says at the end of the story, watch therefore, because you don't know the day or the hour. And so watchfulness pertains to looking at things around us with discerning hearts. Like Mary, when the angel comes to her and tells her about Jesus and what's going to happen to her, the Bible says she pondered these things in her heart. Let's be like that. You should ponder these things in your heart. Not be wigged out by them. In 1 Chronicles 12, there's a group in Israel. They're called the men of Issachar. There's this great verse, 1 Chronicles 12, where the men of Issachar are praised because they, quote, had an understanding of the times, unquote. You choose to be a man or woman of Issachar. Don't be foolish. Don't have your head buried in the sand. Know history. Know your Bibles. Know what's going on in the world. Look beyond southern Maryland and this part of the world. Think globally and know human nature. And listen to the Spirit of God as you do this. Don't just assume that the way you've experienced life during your time on the earth and in the place where you've grown up, don't assume that it's always that way. But as you do this thinking, my friends, never panic. Don't give in to fear. Don't despair. Live joyfully, live richly, live fully, but be wise and watch and pray. The lesson that comes from the next story, the story of the talents, is this: work and pray. Write that down. In this story, a master parcels out varying amounts of money to 3 different servants. And he says, I'm going to go away for a while. You use this. Do some good with this until I come back. And when he returns, he takes an accounting from them. It's a beautiful picture of the various gifts and talents and passions and abilities that God has given to each one of you that are watching right now. And what the story is saying to us is that God wants you to use those gifts and talents. Use them to increase God's beauty and goodness and love and truth. And so do that. Don't throw away your life. Don't waste this talent, these passions, this call that God has given to you. Don't waste it. So did God give you a love for science? Then run with it. You grow up and you be the person who discovers the next vaccine for the next pandemic. Or you be the one to develop a more efficient way to get fresh water to those living in villages in Haiti. Did God give you a love for the arts? Then grow in it. Use it. Bless the world with your creativity and your vision. But Barry, you say, the world may be ending. No, don't think that way. You don't know what the future holds. You only know who holds the future. And so serve Him and live for Him. Live richly for Him. You know what? And even if it does end, you know what? Every ending is just a new beginning. So why don't you choose to live for the new beginning? Legend has it that the famous saint, St. Francis of Assisi, was asked once, what would you do if tomorrow you knew the world was going to end? And you know how he answered? Plant a tree. There was a Christian comedian when I went to college named Mike Warnke. He put it a little more roughly. He said, you know what, if I'm getting raptured, I'm going to grab 2 unbelievers and hoist them up with me and tell them, repent or I'm dropping you. That's the idea. Work and pray. And the lesson that comes from the story of the sheep and goats is this. Write this down. Love and pray. As you read this story, I want you to observe the difference between what the sheep did and what the goats did. And then you make a decision. Which one will you be like? It all comes down to this in the end. As you're loving God, will you love your neighbor as well. Jesus said, we read it earlier, the love of many at the end of the age will grow cold. Don't you let that happen to you. Let the love of Christ so fill you, my friends, that it just oozes from your pores, that you can't help but love and serve and sacrifice for people, even in a time like this. You live that way. You dedicate yourself to living that way, to loving and praying. And guess what you'll hear when you see Jesus face to face? Jesus tells us what he's going to say to us in the story. Imagine hearing these words. Come, you who are blessed by my Father, and inherit the kingdom that was prepared for you.